in the 81 World Series when we flew back to Los Angeles. When I got to the ballpark the day that we had practice there, I walked out into the dugout and I heard somebody whistle. And I looked up and I saw Jeff sitting in the Dodger dugout, and he was talking to a gentleman. I recognized the gentleman. I had never met the gentleman before. So, Jeff waved, I waved, and they were approaching home plate. So I did the same thing from the Yankee dugout. I had always told Jeff my heroes as younger kids growing up was Koufax and Ford. So I had got to meet Whitey many times. I had never, ever met Sandy. Jeff, once he made the introductions, he kind of got off on the side. Sandy and I had a great talk. We even autographed our caps and exchanged them. Mine is in my trophy case, and Sandy says his is on the mantle at his house. So if my house burns, I'm coming in for only one thing, that hat. And, when you think about the hat, you think of Jeff, because the guy that autographed that hat threw a perfect game to Jeff. Every time I look at the hat, I think of Jeff. So he's here, not physically, but here.
Spring of 2002, and I'm throwing up. It's the very first day of spring training, and Sandy Koufax is there, really not as a coach, but just as an observer and maybe more of a consultant. And he's in shorts and a T-shirt, and I can't wait to share with him that I'm friends with, I was roommates with Greg, and I know Jeff and that connection, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with him. So Sandy's walking back and forth, looking at some guys throwing, and he comes up from behind me, and I'm getting nervous. That's Sandy Koufax. And he comes up behind me and he says, "Hey, you got pretty good rotation on that curveball. How do you hold it?" So I turn and I really look at him and I kind of hold my hand. And I look the other way and I hold my hand kind of in his face. And I say, like this, I hold my curveball like this. Well, he grabs my hand and he says, if you took your thumb and you put a little bit, have you ever tried taking your thumb and put it more on the side, you might get a little more snap. Well, I turn around and I said, "Hey, I don't know what kind of curveball you had when you played, but mine's pretty good. I don't mess with it." So, of course, I'm joking. The great Sandy Koufax, he had a curveball that broke 6 feet. Mine broke 2 inches, and only because of gravity. And so I turn around, I throw another pitch to the catcher, and I turn around and I said, "Sandy, I am just joking. My name is Mike Trombley. I room with Greg Torborg in college. I've known Jeff for years." And we really struck a nice conversation. Well, the funny part of this is he was such a humble, down-to-earth guy who had every right in the world to be very arrogant, but he wasn't. I swear he was this close to saying, "Hey, you punk, I'm Sandy Koufax." But we really struck up a nice conversation. We shared a lot of stuff that day, and I'm really proud. And I told Greg that story, and he told his dad, and he had a big chuckle over it.
It was a great 40 years plus in Major League Baseball. But in the early years, people think, well, how did you get started as a young player trying to become a manager? Were you thinking about managing? Were you planning a career in managing? No, not really. But as a young player, some of the craziest things happen in a ball player's life. For an example, 1964 was my rookie year with the Dodgers. I joined a team that was defending world champions with the likes of Don Drysdale, Sandy Koufax, John Roseboro, Maury Wills, Tommy and Willie Davis. A great team. And here I break into the lineup as a platoon catcher with John Roseboro, the great Dodger catcher. Well, very often when you're at the major league level, people say, what is the toughest thing for a young player? And you'll think, well, probably believing that you belong there. After all, now you're playing with the same guys that you were asking for autographs from or admiring from afar on television for all those years as a young little leaguer and even before that. But in my case, for an example, I felt, well, one of the ways that you really have to break into major leagues, you've got to get the respect of your teammates. And of course, there are other respects that you would like to get to from the opposition, from the fans, from the umpires, from the media, all over the place. Well, some people go about it in different ways. For an example, one of the ways I got the respect of my teammates, at least in a strange way, happened in St. Louis in 1964. I'm in the bullpen. I've barely been in a major league game. And again, I told you this is the defending world champions with the great players of the Dodgers past. I get a call in the bullpen. You're going in the game. Who, me? Yeah, you're going in the game. So I hop up and I run to the dugout in St. Louis. And Old Bush Stadium has a very deep dugout and had a metal railing in front of the dugout. So with all my excitement, I run into the dugout to go in the game, duck under that railing, and I miss all 6 steps in the dugout, flat on my back in the bottom of the dugout, on the floor in the cement, when an old coach who had been and who is now a Hall of Fame manager, Leo DeRocher, Leo the Lip, not known for being the most diplomatic guy, standing over me. Now I'm lying flat, knocked the wind out of myself, embarrassed that you can't believe. He's calling me safe on the ground, giving me the safe sign. So this was a unique way of gaining the respect of my teammates. I tried some other unique ways of gaining the respect of the opposition, and again, my teammates. Also, maybe the umpire and some of the fans. We were playing a game in 1964 in Wrigley Field. And the Cubs had a very good base runner named Jimmy Stewart. Not the actor now. This is Jimmy Stewart from Alabama, who was really a good base runner. And he and I had developed a little bit of a rivalry in the minor leagues and in the instructional league before we got to the big leagues. And he came to bat this particular day at Wrigley Field. And I said, Stu, if you get on, try me. Try to steal a base. I'm going to gun you out. And he kind of chuckled. And sure enough, he gets on base with a walk. On the first pitch, he didn't even mess around. He takes off for second base. I come up throwing, make a real strong throw to second. At least I thought it was strong, but it was a little high, and he slides in safely. Now, I didn't feel too bad about it because it was not a throw that went into the outfield. It was a strong throw. But I thought to myself, well, at least if he takes off for third base, I got a chance to get him because it's much closer. You know, third base is only 90 feet away. Well, Jimmy Stewart was not afraid of Jeff Torborg because he went on the first pitch, takes off for third base, and I come up throwing, and I gun a perfect throw to Tommy Davis. The only problem was Tommy Davis was playing left field at the time. So now you've got to picture this. I've allowed this base runner to go from first base to second, second to third, third to home, all by myself, without the benefit of a base hit. So as he's getting up from third base and he's running toward home plate and the ball is in the outfield, I take my mask off and I flip it aside, you know, just to show everybody around the ballpark that I don't do this every day. I don't throw balls away and I don't allow runners to embarrass me like this very often. Now the greatest embarrassment began. I turned around, the run is scored, no mask. I asked the umpire, have you seen the mask? He said, no, I haven't seen the mask. And at Wrigley Field in those days, they had a PA announcer named Pat Piper, who years before, this is how long he had been at Wrigley Field, used to be the PA announcer over a megaphone, not electronic, a megaphone. Well, now what he did was sit there with a long cord and a microphone, and he would also take the balls to the umpire, and he would announce the game from there. So he's bringing a ball to the umpire, and I said, Mr. Piper, did you happen to see my mask? He said, no. Well, early in the game, now you got to remember this was 1964 at Wrigley Field. Now, it's not like it is now where it's a happening where the place is packed. They didn't even open the upper deck at Wrigley Field in those days. They didn't want to pay the sweepers and the ushers to have to clean up when there's hardly any fans in the upper deck. So when you're in a ballpark, when there are fewer fans, you can hear every individual voice, and you can hear them chiding you, getting on you. You know, the louder they are, the more you hear them. And there was this older woman who had a raucous voice, and she was a great Cub fan, and she'd been all over the Dodgers all game long. And I'm looking around, can't find a mask, and I hear, here it is! Oh no. The mask was right under where this woman was sitting. And in Wrigley Field, there was a trough where the water would run off, and it was cement, and it was up against the brick wall. So I race over, and you got to imagine this now. I'm not very comfortable after all that's just transpired. I'm going to run and get this mask and get back as quick as I can to home plate so maybe nobody will notice me. I get over there, and the mask is lodged in that drain. I have to sit down, put my feet against the wall, and pull it out. All the while, this woman is leading cheers, and not for me, but right over me. And I got it loose, and I went out. So you can see there are unique ways of preparing for managing jobs. There are unique ways of getting the respect of the opposition, the umpires, and the fans. And unfortunately, I don't wish this on anybody. I've got another unique way that I got the great relationship with umpires begun. 1964 again, you see there's a continuity in these stories that the early years, younger players do some crazy things. I get called into a game in Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, the old ballpark. And the pitcher for the Dodgers is the great Don Drysdale, Hall of Famer, 6'6", 230 pounds, with nasty sinking fastball and a good hard slider, and also a pitch that people say, what was that? It was called a spitball in those days, which was illegal then and still illegal, but it was used at times, just had a diving action. But the spitball didn't have anything to do with this incident. I'm catching, all gunned up, because I'm going into the 7th inning to catch the great Don Drysdale for the defending world champion Dodgers. And they had a hitter on the Pittsburgh side of the field named Smokey Burgess. Now, Smokey Burgess was a backup catcher, but a real good pinch hitter. Now, he didn't have the greatest physique in the world. He had a little pot sticking out. And, you know, in Major League Baseball, what they do is they time your running speed down to first base or from first to second with a stopwatch. Well, Smokey's speed was such that they timed him with a sundial. That's how slow he was. Well, anyway, Don Drysdale proceeds to walk the first hitter that I'm in the game for, Smokey Burgess. He's on first base. So now, pitchers and catchers have signs that they go over. The catcher will initiate it. 1's a fastball, 2's a curve, 3's a slider, 4's a change, almost universal still in these days, and even in a little league at this time, I would guess. So I give Don Drysdale a slider sign, I thought. Now, you know, I think probably the veteran Hall of Fame pitcher was probably wrong from my perspective, but I don't think he would agree with that. So with this slider, I pretend that, start to move out as though I'm going to catch this slider on the outside, and the fastball sails right over my shoulder. Now, the umpire behind the plate is Ed Vargo, veteran umpire, very good umpire. Now, you got to picture this. I didn't lay leather on this at all. This went over my shoulder, it hit Ed Vargo in the stomach, and all I heard was, "Ooh!" Now I turn around and he's bent over, and I can't get around him. I can't find the ball. And this little dance that we did took so long that Smokey Burgess went from first to third. So you can imagine this was like a long time movie. Well, now the nerves are starting to come. I'm starting to hear pounding in my ears. Oh man, I got to get out of this. Somehow we got to get out of this without a run scored. I'm going to be an embarrassment for the Dodgers and not impress Don Drysdale. Was somehow, as the inning proceeds, we're getting out of it. But I hear Ed Vargo say, "I'm going to be sick." I said, "Oh no, Mr. Vargo, I've got enough trouble. Don't you be sick on me here now. We got to get out of this game." Well, somehow we got out of it. But that doesn't end the story here. Ed Vargo, veteran umpire, leads into the next season. We're playing a game at Dodger Stadium, and the Dodgers have a left-handed pitcher named Claude Osteen. And at the time, we were unaware that he needed glasses, so he was messing up the signs. We didn't realize it at the time. Ed Vargo's behind the plate, Claude Osteen on the mound, and Jeff Torborg catching. And now I start to brag. I'm in my second year in the major leagues. I'm feeling pretty sure of myself. I said, "Eddie, remember last year at Pittsburgh when I missed that pitch?" He said, "Yes." He said, "You made quite an impression on me." I guess that was a pun on his behalf. I said, "Well, that will never happen again, you know, not with the experience I have in the major leagues now. I belong here, I'm a big leaguer," and so on and so forth. Well, whomever the hitter was, I call a couple pitches and we get down a couple outs in the inning. And now Claude Osteen is looking in for the sign, and I give a 2 for a breaking ball sign, a curveball. I lean down to get the breaking ball, and he fires a fastball over my shoulder again, completely miss it. The ball hits Ed Vargo in the mask. And if you can envision metal with a hammer hitting metal, pow! It hit Ed Vargo right in the mask. Well, with that, he calls timeout, and he goes a wide kind of a walkway out to the mound, and he calls for Walter Alston, our Hall of Fame manager. "Get this kid out of here, he's going to kill somebody."
Number 35, Frank Thomas.
Every now and then, Jeff had come in after the game and he was quick. I'll tell you that. He was quick. You can watch the guys in certain towns. where if they had family, friends, whatever it is, I mean, they got zippers on their clothes. And he'd come in every night, and we'd sit there, maybe have a beer or something, a soft drink after the game, and he would have his clothes. He'd go over and he'd make a sandwich, wrap it up real nice, set it in a sack, and set it on his stool. Next night, same thing, and he'd take off, drive down the turnpike, and come home. Well, we had some guys, and like I say, you didn't know the mentality of the Dodger pitching staff. They were a little loose, and we said, we can't let this happen. That isn't right. He can't be doing that, taking food out of our mouth. Rudy Rutgers driving home and eating all the food. What the hell is this? And we got to stop that right away. So Jeff, the next night, finished closing night, and I think we were coming to New York, so it was natural for him to come home and then meet us on up in New York the next day. In he goes, we're sitting there watching him, fixes his sandwich, puts it in the bag, and now goes into the shower. And as he went into the shower, we very quietly reached over, took out the bag, took a sanitary sock, which was the white under socks that the ball players wear, took and rolled it up inside of the bag, and the sandwich, pulled it up real nicely and back in the bag, and that was it. And Jeff came out, got dressed, well, went and met his family, I guess, and on his way back down the turnpike, and I'll let him finish telling you the story.
This one particular game, Willie Mays, it's his first time up against Drysdale, and I'm catching, and I see Willie dig in. Willie always dug in really deep, and he looked out at the mound, and he realized it was Drysdale. Now, I can't imagine that he had forgotten it was Drysdale, but I don't know whether when he was digging in, he didn't think much about it. He called timeout, and he filled the hole in. And after he filled the hole in, he looked out at Drysdale as if to say, see, I filled the hole in. Next pitch, down he went.
He was so competitive. I'll tell you one story. When on the road, we'd say, we had an off day in Cincinnati, I think it was. And he said, hey, let's go down and get something to eat around 4 o'clock. So, okay. We were kind of walking out, getting ready to leave the room, and he said, we're going to talk about basketball. And Jeff was a football player that loved playing basketball. And so we somehow got on somebody, and he said, well, if I was doing this, here's how I would, drive on him. So, I got down in a position like I was going to guard him. Well, he didn't go around you. He went through you. He knocked me over the bed. He knocked the lamp down because we had turned the lamp upside down. And by the time we left, about 20 minutes later, the room was in shambles because he'd hit me about 10 times. He hit me everywhere but the roof of my mouth. He was a kick, but he loved basketball, and so we talk about it all the time. And yeah, I'm glad I didn't have to pitch the next day because he really worked me over.
Now, every player ends his career somewhere along the way as a player, and where they go from there, who knows? Do they go into business? Do they leave? Well, I never left. I became a coach, and then later a manager, and then back to coaching again. Well, one of my great experiences was after managing the Cleveland Indians for 2.5 years, I became a coach for the New York Yankees. And those were the great Yankee teams that came out of the 70s, having won world championships in 77, 78. Well, I joined them in 79. And in 1980, we won 103 games, but lost the playoffs. In 81, went to the World Series. But I had grown up in New Jersey, and I was a Yankee hater. I didn't like the Dodgers either. I was a Giant fan because my dad was a Giant fan. But as soon as I signed a Dodger contract, I loved the Dodgers and didn't like the Giants anymore. Well, as soon as I put that Yankee uniform on, there was something special there. Those pinstripes do mean something. And the irony of the experiences that I've had, the first day that I put the Yankee uniform on was the day that Thurman Munson was buried. I signed on with the Yankees 2 days after I was fired as the manager of the Cleveland Indians in 1979. The Yankees and Thurman Munson and I sat. He didn't play this day game on a Wednesday at Yankee Stadium. The team was going away for a week to play on the out in Milwaukee and the West Coast. And Thurman said, I'll see you when you get back, when we get back. And obviously, I never saw him again. And that first night putting that uniform on, when the Yankees took the field and I went out to become the bullpen coach, one of the bullpen coaches, and the Yankees left home plate open. There was no catcher standing there because their captain was gone, was just moving to me. And Bobby Mercer, who passed away this year, and what a great loss it is for all his friends and people in baseball. Bobby gave one of the eulogies that day at Thurman's funeral. We flew back on a chartered flight from Canton, Ohio to New York to play at Yankee Stadium against the Baltimore Orioles. And Bobby Mercer had one of the greatest games of his life. I don't know what he was on emotion, pure emotion. He had to be exhausted, no sleep all night, flying all day. He had a 3-run homer to tie the game, or to get us close at least, and then put a 2-run single down the left field line. He drove in all 5 runs that night to win the game for the Yankees. And if that isn't something of Yankee mystique, I don't know. That adds in there with a Yankee pinstripe mystique. Well, I spent 10 years as a Yankee coach and enjoyed immensely those years. Unique team. I was with Billy Martin. He was hired and fired 5 different times. I was with him 4 of those times. Was with the great Yogi Berra, one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life all those years. And those stories you hear about Yogi are true. He says some things that you say, like that Aflac duck looked at and said, whoa, did he really say that? But you know what he meant. He's just a wonderful human being. But the experience I had as a Yankee coach, when you think about the players of those Yankee teams, Ron Guidry, Greg Nettles, Willie Randolph, what a great career he had, Chris Chambliss, Rick Cerrone was a catcher for part of that time, Dave Winfield, Don Mattingly. Don Mattingly and Winfield together trying to win a batting title. And to the last day of the season, I remember throwing batting practice to both of them the last day of the season. And Mattingly just pulled ahead and won the batting title. And then the following year won the MVP. And yet we never went to the World Series after '81 until Joe Torre got there in the 90s. It was an experience that so much is made. You hear Tom Lasorda talk about the Dodger blue and the Dodger uniform. That meant a great deal to me too, because of Mr. and Mrs. O'Malley, the owners of the Dodgers. Well, the Yankees and George Steinbrenner and those pinstripes and that legend, when I got to the Yankees, all of a sudden, who was there? Mickey Mantle, Whitey Ford, Joe DiMaggio, the great Yankees. Roger Maris would come in town, Tom Tresh, they would all come. So it was a very special experience. However, there were some funny times, and I've got to tell you a couple about Yogi. I was Yogi's bench coach when he managed, and I believe it was '83. And there were some things that happened, and it showed you the great instincts that Yogi had. I guess it had to be '85, because Dave Righetti had pitched a no-hitter on the 4th of July, 1983. And in the following year, we made him a reliever because Goose Gossage became a free agent and went to San Diego and took San Diego to the World Series. Well, in this one particular game, Dave Righetti's trying to get the last out in the game, and he became a great reliever. In fact, he set the existing record at the time with 46 saves, which since has been broken several times. But in this particular game, I'm standing with Yogi, and to show the great instincts, he says, "Tell Righetti to throw a curveball." I said, "Yogi, he hasn't thrown a curveball in 3 months. You know, he's been a reliever. He's only been throwing fastball, slider." He said, "No, tell him to throw a curveball." I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah." Whistle out there, curveball, throws a curveball. The hitter never even took the bat off his shoulder. Strike 3, game's over. And Yogi said, "See, that's what I meant." That was the way Yogi was. He was great. There was another time I was standing next to him in the dugout. And he said, "You think we ought to run him here?" I said, "Well, you got the tying run at second base. I don't know if we should." Well, before I got the words out of my mouth, the next ball was hit on the ground, double play, where the inning's over. He said, "I should have run him." I said, "Yogi, do not listen to me. Do what's in your heart and do what's in your gut, because that's why you're in the Hall of Fame." But then he would say some funny things. He called the bullpen one time. We had a catcher named Juan Espino. And I get a call on the bullpen, and it's Yogi calling. He said, "Send Nino in." Nino? I don't know who Nino is. We don't have a Nino. Well, I didn't want to embarrass Yogi. I said, "What position does he play?" He said, "You know, Nino Espinosa, the catcher." Well, Nino Espinosa was a pitcher Yogi had when he managed the Mets back in the 70s. So from then on, whenever he called for Nino, I sent Juan Espino in. Another time I was his bench coach, and he asked for, what the heck was the name he used? Well, he was trying to get me to get Stan Javier ready to go in the game. Now, Stan Javier was Julian Javier's son and had a great career in the major leagues, but he was just a young kid with the Dodgers. But there was another Latino name that Yogi used. I can't even remember, but the same thing happened. He said to me, "Get so-and-so up." And I had made out the lineup card. I know he wasn't on our roster. I didn't know who he was talking about. I said, "What, Yogi, what does he look like?" He said, "He's that little outfielder." I said, "Oh, I know who you mean." So from then on, whenever he used the name, and it wasn't Stan Javier, I would get Stan Javier ready to go, and we would laugh about it. We had a good time. But one time, Yogi's wife Carmen, who is wonderful. Yogi's got a great family, by the way. 3 sons who are all athletes, and they all made it to the major leagues. Timmy, the middle boy, was a pro football player with the Colts, and the oldest boy, Larry, was a good player in college at Montclair State College. So they got a real athletic family. But Carmen is the one that keeps things straight. Well, Yogi gets a call from Carmen, and they had gone to see the movie Dr. Zhivago. And when Carmen said, "I took the boys to see Dr. Zhivago," he said, "I didn't even know they were sick." And but to hear him say it is great, because you know what he meant. He meant he just had a way of saying unique things. Another time we had the phones in the dugout that one of them would go to the bullpen and one would go upstairs. And we had an eye in the sky with Gene Michael, and he would set up the defenses. And somebody had put the telephone upside down on the cradle, and Yogi picked it off, and he's got hold of it, and he's yelling, "I can't hear you, speak up, I can't hear you." He didn't even notice the phone was upside down, and he's talking in the wrong end. That's why he couldn't hear it upstairs. But we had some funny things happen, and later on when Billy Martin took over, there were some experiences that weren't so funny, but because Billy was intense, amazingly intense man. And when he would come, he'd come all to the Yankees when he'd be rehired, and he'd come back and he'd be all tan and looking good. Well, about 2 weeks into the season, he was so intense and wanted to win so badly, and he wasn't eating properly, and maybe a few drinks here and there. He wasn't looking real good, and he wasn't sleeping real well, especially not before day games. And I can remember he says to me one day, "I want you to stay in the dugout today," because I was a co-pitching coach with him, and I didn't know what he was up to. And finally he explains it to me. He says, "Matt Keogh is going to start this game." And Matt Keogh had been a star for him in his rotation at Oakland, if you remember, in 1980 or 1981. But we had gotten him in a trade. Well, we were playing Oakland, and Billy was afraid that Matt Keogh was not going to be successful against him. So he started another pitcher warming up alongside him, Bob Shirley, our left-hander. Well, Billy said to me, "I don't know how well Keogh's going to take this if I yank him out after 1 or 2 hitters, so I want you to go get him." So I think, oh, okay, now I see what's going on here. But that's just one of the Billy stories. And I obviously, he was taken out of the game. I went to get him, and I explained the whole situation. He said, I understand, don't worry about it. But Bob Shirley, for example, came into that game, and then something would happen. And when Yogi was manager, for example, Bob Shirley said, Yogi went up to Bob, and this is how everybody loved Yogi. Yogi went up to him, and Shirley was mad at him for taking him out of the game. Yogi put his arm around him and said, "Are you mad at me?" Bob Shirley looks at him and said, "Nobody can be mad at Yogi Berra. Nobody." And he was furious, but he said, "Nobody can be mad at you, Yogi." And that's just the way Yogi was. But Billy was a different story. He was aggressive, and there were times where there were some shenanigans in the dugout. If anybody remembers the Reggie Jackson situation where Billy pulled him out of the outfield in front of everybody off the field in Fenway Park in Boston, because Billy didn't think he ran hard enough to get the ball back into the infield. And there was almost fisticuffs in the dugout. So 4 of those 5 times kept me on my toes as a coach with the Yankees, but they were great experiences. And of course, George Steinbrenner, of all the characters in the game, he was a unique one. But I'll say one thing for George Steinbrenner. George Steinbrenner wanted to win as much as any player on his team, and he put his money where his mouth was. He played the free agency market as well as it's ever been played. So whatever the criticism of George could be, and he could be tough, and he could be tough on his employees, he was a guy that you wanted to be around because he wanted to win. So my experiences with the Yankees for 10 years were unique, and I'll never forget them. I just got a book about Yankee Stadium and all those memories, and I was asked back last year to the Old Timers game, and 72 of us stood on the foul lines, and Willie Randolph was welcomed back after that miserable way he was treated on the other side of town with the Mets, and they gave him a standing ovation, and he wouldn't stop for 5 minutes. We were all in tears. It was beautiful.
I'm 10 years old, And Frank's taken early BP. Here's Frank Robinson, unbelievable player. Now he's a first black manager in baseball. He's a player manager on top of that. And he's taking extra BP, and I'm out there in left field, try to get somewhere where most of the balls are hit, get a little action, And I'm out there in my red Indians T-shirt and my jeans and my cleats and my Wilson glove, outfielder's glove, which is probably bigger than my head. And I'm out there kind of near the warning track, and Frank is hitting bullets, over the wall, off the wall, this and that and the other. He hits a line drive seed at me. And so I think I closed my eyes, put my glove up, and somehow caught the ball up against the fence. And Frank, Dad said so much, has always said so much about we owed a lot to Frank. He owed a lot to Frank. Hiring him as a coach after his playing days were over, how much he learned from Frank, how much he thought of Frank as a baseball man and just a man, period. But he was good to us kids too. He stopped BP for a second. He stepped out of the cage, raised it. I still remember this. Raised his bat up and said, "Nice catch, Doug." And I was so proud of that. I actually somehow the glove stayed on my hand and didn't get ripped off. The guy was still hitting BBs in 1975. But that was a good memory. Frank was good to us as kids.
Well, I played with Frank my last active year in the major leagues, 1973 with the Angels. He had gotten traded over from the Dodgers, and even when he was not as healthy as he had been in the past, he still hit 30 home runs. That's how great a hitter he was. Well, he brought me back into the game. I had been out after being released in spring training from the Cardinals in 1974. Frank gets named the manager of the Cleveland Indians, and he calls me and brings me back. And, there have been times in the past, and he replaced me as the manager of the Expos when I went to the Marlins. So there's a lot of connections. But I've tried over the years to thank Frank for what he's done. And, Frank is a big, tough guy, without a doubt, one of the greatest competitors who'd ever played the game. I even wrote him a letter telling him that, there are certain people in your life and in everybody's life who make a difference in a person's life and change the direction of their lives. That's what Frank did for me, bringing me back as a coach to Cleveland, and then I replaced him as manager with Cleveland, which was really tough. So I'd like to relate a couple experiences, kind of both sides of the Frank Robinson that so many people saw from a distance. We were playing a game, an exhibition game this is now, in Toledo, Ohio. And this will show the competitive nature of Frank Robinson. He's already well on the way to the Hall of Fame, nearing the end of his career. And there had been a pitcher that we acquired from the Baltimore Orioles named Bob Reynolds, who was built like a fullback, probably maybe 6 feet tall, 230-pound relief pitcher. And in spring training, he got sent to the minors. And Frank wasn't there at the time because he had the team over in Yuma, Arizona, so I had to tell Bob Reynolds that he had been sent to the minor leagues. Well, Bob never appreciated that, and he felt that he was not respected enough that Frank didn't tell him. Well, he couldn't tell him. It just wasn't, in the cards. We were on the road. So we get the word from some of the team that had been sent to the minor leagues back to the grapevine to Cleveland that if Frank Robinson plays in the exhibition game against the Toledo Mud Hens, our AAA farm club with Cleveland, that Bob Reynolds was going to get Frank. And I said, Frank, you better watch out. This guy might be serious. And Frank, as strong as he was, kind of poo-pooed it. So Frank went to bat in Toledo that night, and Bob Reynolds throws a ball about, right over Frank's head, only about 15 feet high. It wasn't close to hitting him, but it was a message pitch. And Frank just stood there and looked at him like, what's going on? Well, Frank then swung at the next pitch, hit it to left field, and as he rounded first base, he came across the mound. Now, I'm coaching third base now for the Indians, and Bob Reynolds says something to Frank. Well, Frank gets to the third base coach's line, and Frank said, wait a minute, you can't talk to me like that. With that, Bob Reynolds turns off the mound and sprints toward Frank with his hands clutched like he's going to do something. I tell you, I saw 3 of the fastest punches I've ever seen in my life. A left, 2 lefts and a right, and Bob Reynolds spun out like a cartoon where, the eyes go around in circles and the guy starts to spin around, and I laid Bob Reynolds down. He was out cold. Well, Frank caught all sorts of heat from the media for that. That is the side of Frank that a lot of people read about and heard about. Well, that's what made him so great. He had a great intestinal fortitude and competitiveness, and he was tough as nails, and what he had gone through as a young black player in the South was difficult, and Frank was just a tough guy. But he also was a guy that was really caring. When I replaced Frank as the manager of the Cleveland Indians, a job that I turned down 5 times with Phil Segi and the owner at the time, Ted Bonda, I said, Frank doesn't deserve to be fired. He's done a terrific job here. And they said, well, we're going to make a change. And I said, well, I don't want the job. Well, 5 times I turned it down, so I'm in Frank's office, and we're both in tears. And I said, Frank, I don't want your job. He said, Jeff, it's not my job anymore. They're taking it away from me. So if you think you can do the job, take it and continue what we've tried to do here. With that, I accepted the job. We played a doubleheader that day against the Detroit. I had never made a lineup card out at any level. We had 2 complete games, beat Detroit both ends of the doubleheader. I never made a change. I just sat there and watched the game, gave some signs, and that was it. Well, we won 8 in a row. I thought I was going directly to the Hall of Fame as a result of that. But I've got to tell you something. Now, we're talking about the great Frank Robinson, who had spent all those years as a great player on the way to the Hall of Fame. And for 9 of his last playing years, he had finished his playing season and gone to Puerto Rico to learn how to manage. Now, here I am replacing him, never having prepared to manage at all. I had been a mediocre player, knew a lot about pitching and catching, but knew nothing about managing. So after winning that doubleheader in Detroit, we head off to Toronto on the road. And do you know that first day on the road, I get a call from Frank Robinson. Here's the man who's been deposed. And you got to think that somewhere in his mind he thought, well, was Jeff responsible for getting my job? Was he really working behind the scenes? Because the guy never really knows. I know I've been fired since, and you often wonder how loyal the guys were around you, some of them. Frank called for 8 to 10 consecutive days to help me set up the lineup, ask me what I was planning on doing, giving his suggestions. Now, people don't know that about Frank Robinson. They see the rough, tough guy that slides into second base and takes the shortstop halfway into left field. Or they see the guy that knocks Bob Reynolds cold at third base in a AAA game. But this is the Frank Robinson I know, and boy, he is special to me. And I think he's very special to a lot of people because he's the example of how the game should be played. I had a great relationship with George Steinbrenner. I mean, he was a tough boss. There were times we did some yelling at one another. There were other times we just had a quiet respect for one another. And one that I recall thinking about is, this day and age when there's a brand new Yankee Stadium and old Yankee Stadium across the street, the memorabilia of the stadium seats and people want pieces of the past history. Well, I was one of the first that really got a big piece of past history. And it was part of George Steinbrenner's doing. And that was every year at the end of the year, or maybe sometimes every other year, they would cut up the infield grass and replace it. They would roll it into pieces of sod and replace it. And somehow in the conversation I was saying, well, we were having a terrible time in Mountainside, New Jersey, growing grass at our house on a hill. So I said, oh, you're getting rid of the Yankee Stadium sod. Would it be all right if I came and got some? Sure, get all you want, the boss said. So I rented a 25-foot truck, drove to New York, backed it down in the old Yankee Stadium. That was an experience, packing that big truck that I'd never driven before into Yankee Stadium without hitting something. And then spending about 4 hours lifting, and if you've ever lifted sod, rolled up sod, you know how heavy that stuff is. And it was all the sidelines around home plate and also the infield. And packed it in this truck, and I headed for home. Now, the amazing thing was the truck was overloaded. It was unbelievable. It was so heavy that the bed would hit the wheels every time I hit a bump on the way home. And then finally, when I got to Mountainside, I was afraid of getting out of it for fear the truck was going to roll down the hill, so I had to drive up a neighbor's driveway into our yard. And my wife and I spent another 4 or 5 hours with a light sticking down, hanging down till midnight, unloading this sod. Well, it was the toughest job I think I've ever done physically. We sodded our yard, but I warned our 3 sons, don't tell anybody that our yard is made of Yankee Stadium sod. Can you just see the the memorabilia hunters, the souvenir hunters coming up and starting to peel our yard away. And so that was one of my experiences with George Steinbrenner, taking half his stadium home with me in a truck. But there were several others that come to mind too, that when I look back on them, I have a warmth about them, even though a couple of them almost didn't work out well. I would wait outside Mr. Steinbrenner's office for maybe a week at a time in my Yankee uniform before the Yankees took batting practice, because I wanted to get to meet him and talk about my future with the Yankees. And this would have been in 1980. And I got to know his secretary very well. I was out there every day with her talking, but I made sure that when he couldn't see me, I was back on the field in time for the proper time for batting practice. In fact, one time I said, boss, I got to talk to you. He says, I'm busy today. I said, well, can I just talk to you for a couple minutes? He says, no, I have the governor of Florida coming in. That was Bob Graham, was Senator Bob Graham. So, well, I met the senator as he came in, or the governor at that point as he came into George's office. I met a lot of people waiting outside his office. When I finally got into him to see him, I said I needed a multi-year deal just so that I could make sure I knew what I was doing for the next 2 to 3 years. He said, well, we're not playing the way I'd like to play. I don't want to give multi-year deals out to coaches. I said, I understand. I said, well, I'd like permission to talk to Princeton University. Now, I went to Rutgers, Princeton being the arch rival. A lot of people said, what are you doing? Well, of course, the opportunity to go to a great university like Princeton was very appealing. So having been given that permission, I accepted the Princeton University coach's job, but based on coming back for the 1981 season, because I still had a year left on my contract. Well, at the end of the 1981 season, if you remember, the Yankees went to the World Series. We first beat Milwaukee, and that was that strike-shortened year, and we had an extra level for the first time in history. We played Milwaukee first, won that series, and then went to Oakland and swept Billy Martin's Oakland A's, and then went and won the first 2 games of the World Series against the Dodgers, and then lost the next 4. Well, here I had accepted the job in 1980 and was supposed to begin the Princeton job after 81 when Mr. Steinbrenner on the flight to Oakland said, I'd like you to stay. I was coming out of the restroom and he waved me back to his room, to his seat, I should say, and I sat next to him. He said, go back to your wife and see what it would take to stay. So I went back, sat down, intuitive ways of wives. My wife said, did George offer for you to stay? I said, how'd you know that? She said, I just had a feeling. So we talked about it. She said, why don't you ask for 10 years? I said, 10 years? I don't have the guts to ask for 10 years. So I said I had a 6-year deal with Princeton, so my thought was, well, I should ask for at least 7. So I sat down next to Mr. Steinbrenner, who's a very imposing guy, by the way, a very interesting man. And I sat down and I said, boss, I'm going to need 7 years. He said, 7 years? You got to be kidding. That's ridiculous. So I said, I understand. I really appreciate you're even offering me the job. And I went to get out of the seat, and he pulled me down in the seat. I can take care of this. He said, I know how I'll do it. So I ended up with a 7-year deal, and I went back and told my wife I accepted a deal with the Yankees for 7 years. She said, and I said, gosh, I should have asked for 10. I said, I didn't have the nerve. So now I have to meet with George in his office to go over the contract. We're going over the contract, and he's funny. He's got to win the battles. He doesn't care whether he wins the war. He just wants to win the battles. And in this one clause, he said, well, with a 7-year deal, he said, we got to put this clause in. He said, what if you kill yourself? And it struck me funny. I had to laugh. I said, oh, that's why you got me, for my stability, right? I'm going to kill myself, so you got to make sure you protect yourself in there. And then we both had to laugh over that one. But George is such an interesting guy. In fact, Dick Howser would have been the first to tell you. Dick, of course, had been a very successful third base coach for the Yankees for many years, and then in 1980 became the manager. We won 103 games, but we lost a playoff, and George was not happy the way the season finished. And he, in his initial meeting in Tampa, where he owned a hotel, he said that he was not going to bring Dick back. Understanding, I believe it was Dick and Gene Michael were meeting with him. Well, George got halfway home from that meeting and decided he had made a mistake, and he called back and he said he made a mistake and he wanted to hire Dick, and Dick said too late. And Dick then went on to Kansas City to be a manager, and they won the world championship in that position, and unfortunately died after having had a brain tumor. But tremendous baseball guy. But that was one that an interesting relationship with the manager and the owner, and the manager finally says, no, I'm not going to put up with this. And that was the end of that story. And we've talked so many times about all the legends in the Yankee past and the Yankee tradition. One that you don't hear a lot about is Pete Sheehy, who started out many, many years ago as a bat boy and working in the clubhouse for the Yankees. And he is the one that famously was sent out by Babe Ruth to get a dozen or so hot dogs. And he got caught bringing them back by the manager, and he got in trouble. And Babe said, "Where are my hot dogs?" So he got in trouble on both sides. You know, the big superstar and the manager catches Pete Sheehy. Well, Pete Sheehy stayed with the Yankees for 50-some years. In fact, the clubhouse to this day is named the Pete Sheehy Clubhouse. But Pete was a wonderful gentleman. But he was a prankster. From those days with the hot dogs, later on, you could not turn your back on him in the clubhouse because he had this trick, especially after you got dressed and were going to leave the ballpark. He would take a hanger, and hanging on the hanger would be old sanitaries that you used to wear under your socks. He would hook them to somebody's belt or their back pocket without them knowing it, and they're leaving the ballpark with a hanger with dirty socks hanging on them. Well, one time I was walking past, there's a picnic table in the clubhouse where he used to have the baseballs to be autographed, and he would do different sewing projects and whatever it took to keep the Yankees looking good. And I was pulling up my pants and going to tuck my shirt in, and he was eating a cheeseburger. Well, I guess he couldn't find anything else to throw in there, but he saw an opening in my pants where I was pulling them up before I got my belt done, and he threw the cheeseburger in my pants. And I walked about 3 or 4 steps, and I said, "What the heck is this down in my pants?" And sure enough, it was a half-eaten cheeseburger. Now that's dedication to being a prankster, when you give up your meal or half your meal to make I guess that would be a Hall of Fame prank. But Pete was a wonderful guy. In fact, Billy Crystal did a takeoff on him in I can't remember exactly how it was laid out, but he was in the clubhouse doing an interview as though he were Pete Sheehy, and it was wonderful. He was one of those legends with the Yankees. And a lot of times you think about the great players, well, there were great announcers, but there were behind-the-scenes great people, and Pete Sheehy was one.
There was one time I had to throw a bullpen, and I asked him, I said, "Are you capable of catching a bullpen?" He said, "From you, I got you." So we went down. Instead of having one of the catchers catch me in the bullpen, I got a chance to have him behind the plate. And for me, it dawned on me, this is the same guy who caught a perfect game from Sandy Koufax, and I'm throwing to him right now. And so I just saw him set up, and as soon as I saw him set up, a pitcher can tell you this, you got a catcher that knows what he's doing. And like a lot of the great catchers, when he got behind the plate, suddenly it looked a yard wide. And everything I threw stayed on the corners. It had the right movement. Normally it takes 15 minutes to throw a bullpen. We got it done in 10 or 12 minutes. I looked at him and I said, "Do we need to do anything else?" He says, "Looks pretty good to me. Let's call it a day." Now, that is rapport between a veteran ball player and a former ball player who's a great manager.
I was very fortunate in 1965 to be a platoon catcher, meaning I was right-handed hitter, and John Roseboro, the Dodger all-star catcher, was a left-handed hitter. So I played against left-handed starting pitching. And in those days at the major league level, they were on 4-man rotations, meaning there's only 3 days rest. Now you have the kids on 5 days rest, counting pitch count. Every game, every pitch is counted, and everybody's worried about once you get to 100 pitches. Well, I'm sure that Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale and Nolan Ryan and Don Sutton sometimes got upwards of 165 to 200 pitches in a game, and today everybody gets upset when they get near 100. But I was very fortunate to be around very good pitching staffs, and for me that was a great way to learn how to catch at the major league level in pennant drives. As you can imagine, 1965, the Dodgers were world champions. We beat Minnesota in 7 games after having lost the first 2. But prior to that, now, here's a pitching staff of the great Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale, Johnny Padres, Claude Osteen. Well, they can make a mediocre catcher look pretty good. But I got very fortunate in when those rotations were set in those days, when you had a 4-man rotation. Usually, if you played against another team within a week or 2 weeks in the schedule, you're going to face the same pitchers in the same rotation. In other words, when Sandy Koufax's time came to pitch, he'd be facing another left-hander that he faced a week before, that type of thing. So that's how I was catching Sandy Koufax's perfect game in September 9th, 1965. It was against the Cubs. It was at Dodger Stadium, and it was really an experience that I'll never forget. Sandy Koufax, of course, was at that time in the very, very upper echelon of Major League Baseball and maybe belonged in another league. That's how good he was. And his career would soon end. A year later, he would retire from baseball at 31 years of age because of an arthritic elbow. Even at this particular time when he pitched this no-hitter, this perfect game, which was actually his 4th career no-hitter in 4 consecutive years, Sandy was feeling the effects of arthritis in his elbow, but you would never know it. What a competitor.
He once said to me, we were on an elevator, and he once said to me, as long as I have a job managing in the big leagues, you'll have a job as a player. And then they signed me when he went to New York as the manager. And when he got fired, that was a miserable year. Nothing to do with him. It was just a lot of things that happened off the field. He got fired. And the same day I walked into his office, I knocked on the door, went in, closed the door. And I said, you son of a gun. I said, you just told me that as long as you have a job, I have a job. Now you went and got fired.
There were conversations I had about, when did you come to faith? How are you raising your kids this way? What are the challenges with it? You're hearing these guys curse, spit, scream, chew, scratch. Me, I had too many 4-letter words when I was a player that I would get upset with myself afterwards. And there were times he's like, it's okay. Every now and then, you throw one of those out and it feels good, doesn't it? It doesn't mean you're a bad person. So, don't beat yourself too much because you did that. And just, go to chapel next week, try to do better going forward, but don't worry about it. It's no big deal.
When Goose Gossage, who obviously is a Hall of Famer and was a real force with the Yankees through the 1983 season. After the 83 season was over, he became a free agent. And the Monday before Christmas, Gene Michael and I were dispatched to fly from New York all the way to San Diego to talk to Goose and his agent out in San Diego. And I said, why me? It's the Monday before Christmas. They were getting ready for the family and Christmas time. I said, I'm not the manager. Why doesn't Yogi go out? And Yogi said, I'm not going out there. So Gene Michael and I fly all the way across the country. On the way out, we have a skidding landing. It was freezing in Chicago. We slid on ice, and what an experience this was. And we get to San Diego, and now we spend all day trying to reach Goose and his agent. Well, we finally were able to go to Goose's agent, Jerry Kapstein, in fact, really a good guy, to his office. And we get ushered in the office, and we're waiting and waiting. This is Gene Michael and myself. And in comes Jerry Kapstein. And I know this is all, almost like choreographed. His shirt was all pulled out of his pants. This is a natty dresser type. His hair was all messed up, and he said, I can't convince Goose to go back to New York. So in comes Goose, and I had become very good friends with Goose over the years in the bullpen with him, and I just love the guy and still do. And he said, I'm not going back there. We said, well, Yogi's the new manager. You're going to really enjoy it. He said, well, for how long is he going to be the manager? And bing, bing, and he went on and on. It took a total of 5 minutes for him to tell us he wasn't going back to the Yankees. And Gene Michael and I turned around and went out of the office. And I said, Stick, you're going to have to call George and tell him what happened. He said, oh, yeah? Why me? I said, well, I'm going to go downstairs to that Mexican restaurant and make reservations for dinner for you and me, and then we'll fly back. So for a 5-minute meeting, we flew across the country, the Monday before Christmas, turned around and flew all the way back. And I had Gene Michael tell George that Goose wasn't coming back. So that was one of those experiences that I'm glad I wasn't in the front office at that point. I was still a coach. But, the demands of George Steinbrenner were unique, and he had his own ideas about things and played the free agent market and organizational legends and tradition like no one else before him, and probably no one since.
On one of our charter flights in 1990, we'd go back there and it was just us on the plane and maybe some press, a little bit of press, and obviously the coaches up front. Well, as we were flying into Midway, we were not that far off from landing. I thought it would be funny to go to the back and get the microphone and pretend I was the captain I got on there and said, this is your captain speaking. We're flying at an altitude of approximately 27,000 feet. If you look out to your right, you will see Lake Michigan. If you look out to your left, you will see, and I said, oh my God, pull up. It's the Sears Tower. Well, I thought that was pretty funny. Unfortunately, within about a few seconds, the captain's cabin door swung wide open, and here comes the captain cruising down the aisleway, and I immediately sat in my seat thinking, maybe he won't notice it was me. Unfortunately, he did. He came right up to me, and I don't remember what he said, but he read me the riots and let me have it. And of course, I was feeling about that tall at the time. Well, as he walked back up the aisleway, I look up and I see him and Torborg, and I can tell that they're sharing a laugh. So I thought, that's interesting. Anyhow, we ended up landing, and of course, guys are ribbing me or whatever, but we get off, and Torborg comes up to me, puts his arm around me, and says, hey, I just want to let you know, the captain said that's one of the funniest stuff he's ever heard. He says, however, he suggests maybe not doing it in the near future.
We talked on so many times, and everyone does who ever worked with George Steinbrenner, how unique George was as an owner. And bombastic, impetuous, loyal, intense, all of these things. Well, I had a particular experience with him. The same day that it was announced that Dave Winfield was signing with the Yankees, and obviously he was very involved in that. That was important to him, but at the same time I had a complaint because I was not placed on the pension plan that I had been promised when I first joined the Yankees in 1979 after having left Cleveland. So I wanted to talk to George about it. Well, there's so much flying, and that certainly was not the day for me to interrupt Mr. Steinbrenner, but it was the only day that I was at Yankee Stadium. It was the only way I could reach him. He had been so busy the 3 weeks before, so I had said I had to talk to him. He said, well, not today. It's too busy a day. I said, okay. So I was not real happy about it. And he was all intense about Dave Winfield signing. So I started to leave. I was going to head home. And he grabs me as I'm about to leave Yankee Stadium. He says, come in here. Let's find an office. We'll talk about it. What do you want me to do about your situation? I said, well, you gave me your word back in 1979 I was going to be on the pension. I just want you to stand by your word. He said, are you saying that I'm not a man of my word? I said, I didn't say that. I just said that you had promised me that. Well, what do you want me to do about it? I said, just put me on a pension. And then I made the dumbest comment of all. He said, I'll take care of it. I said, oh, I'm going to take you at your word for that. Oh, did he flip? Well, he went to sit down in one of those spring-back chairs, you know, the desk chairs that have a spring in the back, and he hit that chair, and it flipped him over backwards. And he was like a turtle on his back on the floor, and I'm down, still telling him how I feel about the situation. And, you know, George is a very masculine guy, and he was scuffling, trying to get up. And in subsequent years, every time I think about it, it strikes me funny. At the time, if I hadn't been so mad, I might have laughed. But it was a unique experience, and one that Mr. Steinbrenner and I have never discussed in the years after that. But that was something that was very unique in my relationship with him.
The whole scenario was surreal. That I come up in the ninth inning, we're down by 2. Carlton Fisk was catching, and I'm like, every time I went up there that night, I'm like, are you serious? This guy's like standing right there catching. I mean, you know, I grew up watching him forever, and there's 2 guys on, 2 outs, thick bids on the mound. There's 50,000 people screaming at me. I don't know what's going on in my world with 1 month in the big leagues. Somehow I miraculously hit a home run off Bobby. After we finally got to Montreal, I'm sitting in his office one time, and he brings up that home run, and I've been telling a different story for 11 years. I hit, it wasn't a walk-off home run, but I hit a home run off Thigpen, you know, who was the reliever of the year that year, and in the ninth inning, we won the game, you know, and blah, 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 you know, and all happy and everything. And then Jeff's side of the story, he's for 11 years, he's been telling about he gets pulled over and gets a speeding ticket and lost the game. And I was cracking up.
For the longest time, that Lee Stevens name ended up being basically a 4-letter word in our house, because he hits that home run and we're, Lee Stevens, jeez. And we got to know Lee. And Lee, to this day, is still one of my favorite people now. He is just what an incredible guy. So, he went from being a 4-letter word in our family to being, one of the guys that I consider one of my favorite people on the planet.
So Jerry Royce, long career and good success, but pitching in the World Series for the first time.
Go back to 1981 when he was with the Yankees. I met him for the first time, and we were playing in the World Series. We had a chance to say hello. I knew his history with Sandy, and we had something in common right there. And we seemed to hit it off, but he was with the Yankees, and I was with the Dodgers. You just don't do that back in those days. But now we're on the same club, so we got along very well. And I pitched well for Jeff, won 8 games for him before I was traded to Milwaukee. And, well, it was a disaster for me in Milwaukee. Now I was going to be 41 years old in 1990, and I wanted to finish my career on my terms. Except I couldn't find a team. So I called Jeff, and I said, I want to ask him, I'd like to go to spring training with you if you can find some innings for me and a way for me to display that I can still pitch to another team. He says, I'd love to have you. Didn't hesitate a bit. And he says, but I'm going to tell you, with the kids that we got coming up, these kids, they're ready. And there's not really going to be a spot for you with us. But I'll get you the innings and I'll get you the chance for other teams to see you. And he did just that. Led to a job with Houston, and ultimately I ended up with Pittsburgh. And I finished my baseball career as an active player on my own terms. Now, you ask any Major League Baseball player just how important that is, and they'll say, that's not something I think about. But when they look back at the end of their career to finish it when they wanted, as opposed to being shown the door, well, that becomes very important. Jeff was instrumental in allowing me to finish my career on my terms.
Those Yankee years from 1979 through 88, there was never a dull moment. Well, in July of 1983, in the top of the 9th inning against the Kansas City Royals, Goose Gossage gave up a gargantuan home run to George Brett. And as Brett circled the bases, the Yankees were out to grab his bat, suggesting that it was illegal, the home run, because the pine tar on the bat was too high. It was above the label. This all came about because Greg Nettles, who is one of the sharpest guys I've ever met in the game of baseball, had noticed it beforehand prior to that, and they were waiting. He and Billy Martin, he had told Billy Martin about it. They were waiting for a unique situation or something that might happen positively for George Brett and the Royals, that they were going to make sure that they disputed what had happened as a result. So after Brett's home run, out comes Billy Martin. He goes to the home plate umpire, Tim McClellan, indicating that the bat is illegal because the pine tar is too high on the bat. And sure enough, Tim McClellan called Brett out, and security people grabbed the bat. There was all sorts of nonsense going on, and George Brett, if you ever see the highlights, comes running out like a madman. He looked like he was going to run right over Tim McClellan. I've never seen George as irate as that. And then I believe Dick Howser and Rocky Colavito, the manager and coach, were ejected as well from the game. But after Major League Baseball thought it out, they suspended the game. Actually, they said it was suspended with 2 outs in the top of the 9th inning. So we had to replay the game because they said that rule should not have called him out. The bat should just been removed from the game. So both teams had to come back in August of that year. The Royals had to fly in, and of course the Yankees from wherever we were had to go in. That was the shortest game I ever was a part of. I think there was 1 out that the Royals had to make, and they made that in the top of the 9th, and we went down 1, 2, 3 in the bottom of the 9th, and we went home. And so that was the experience of and I put in quotes, the pine tar game. And of course, nothing after that will ever be ruled and out as a result of pine tar. But uniquely, what happened in that game as well is when we came back to play it, Ron Guidry, the pitcher, played center field, and Don Mattingly, our left-handed throwing first baseman, who incidentally could throw right-handed as well if he wanted, he went in to play second base. So I don't think anybody has played second base left-handed. I don't know before that how many had, but nobody since has, I'm sure. So it was, again, with the Yankees, never a dull moment. When I was a coach with the Yankees, we really had a close team. Even though a lot of craziness went on in the clubhouse, the team was close. And we had an off day, and my wife and I owned a summer place at the New Jersey Shore, an old fix-up place that we had bought. And we invited a bunch of the Yankees to come down. Dave Righetti, Ron Guidry, Mike Morgan, Barry Foote, Dave LaRoche, even the trainer, Mark Latown, came. And we had a wonderful time. And obviously we didn't broadcast that the players were water skiing. I might have lost my job quite a bit earlier. But we had a ball down there. But we had a ski belt that had a one tab on it that was plastic, and it broke. And everybody got scraped up. We still have a picture of the whole bunch of these Major League ball players and the trainer. Of course, that's my excuse as a coach, that we had the trainer there, showing underneath their shirt the scratches they had from the broken water ski belt. So the people down on the Jersey Shore still remember that the Yankee players had a very difficult time getting up on the water skis, but their wives and girlfriends hopped right up and went all over the place. So to this day, when we talk to neighbors down there, they talk about, oh yeah, I thought they were great athletes. I think the wives were better. But we had a great time, and I never made it known to Mr. Steinbrenner that we had half his team down there water skiing during a season.
Getting to know Jeff and Susie, it just seemed like a natural thing, like you had just moved into a neighborhood and they were the neighbors next door. Jeff had 3 boys, and he always regaled with stories of what they were doing. One memorable Thanksgiving, Jeff and I were talking on the phone, and he asked me what I was doing for Thanksgiving. I told him I was staying in the Bronx. The reason was that I had a little falling out with my dad, and I was being stubborn, and no, I'm not going. I'll just stay in my apartment in the Bronx and have a little celebration there. And Jeff basically said, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're coming to our home in New Jersey and have Thanksgiving with my family. And there was no saying no to Jeff. He was very polite, but he could take a stance and mean it. I will always be grateful because Jeff understood the meaning of family, and he couldn't abide by someone being alone on such a family holiday. And my parents and I never missed one after that, because if someone's teaching you about family, you better darn take the lesson to heart. And I did. And it was a very important moment in my life.
I got a story to tell you about Reggie Jackson when he was a young outfielder with Oakland and I was a catcher with the California Angels. Reggie had a habit in his early years, and in the latter years, every once in a while he flipped the bat funny, but he'd hit a base hit and then he would flip the bat back and it would hit the catcher. Well, we're playing a game in Oakland, a day game in Oakland, and he hits me with this ball, and he really got me. Boy, he got me in the leg. So the next time up, I said, Reg, do me a favor. Stop flipping that bat back. You're working me over. I got black and blue marks from you already. Don't do that anymore, if you would. Sure enough, he hits a base hit to right field, and he flips the bat back, and he gets me again. Well, I was furious. I'm hurting both legs now. So I throw the bat at him. As he rounds first base, I throw the bat at him, and the home plate umpire said, if you ever do that again, you're going to be thrown out of the game and suspended. So that was my first introduction to Reggie and our first experience. So then we ended up together with the Yankees for several years. And I was so impressed the way he played. You know, he was known as Mr. October because basically the 3 home runs in the World Series, if you remember, in that one game against the Dodgers, 4 in a row, counting an at-bat the game before. But he had a way when the spotlight was on. He liked that. You know, a lot of guys back off. They don't want any part of that. They're afraid of being great. Well, Reggie was very special in a lot of ways because he had this big-time power and he could strike out a lot. And when I managed against him I was with Cleveland, I would walk Thurman Munson because Thurman could put the ball in play and didn't strike out much to get to Reggie because if you pitched him right, you could strike him out because he had that big swing. And all I did was anger him, and he got some big hits against us. But as I was coaching with the Yankees, one of the years I was there, I was a first base coach. And the other side of Reggie came out. We were in a very close pennant race and a close game against the White Sox. And if a player wanted to run, I would turn from the first base coach's box and get a yes signal that he could go from Dick Howser. That was in 1980. Well, Reggie said, I can steal second here. Can I go? I said, well, listen, I'll have to ask Dick. He said, well, if you don't get his attention, I'm going to go because I'll be safe. Well, needless to say, I said, don't go until I, get the okay. And I got the okay, stole second base, and he ended up the winning run. He could do the little things. Sometimes he get criticized for his defense. But, part of his problem, if he had any in the outfield, was his glasses. The glasses sometimes gave him a problem, but he had a right field arm, and he really played hard. But then, most recently, now, first of all, he left the Yankees as a free agent to go to the California Angels. And when he left, obviously his number 44 became available, and that's in this Yankee uniform. And there's the 44. So I'll put this up in front of my face, which is better looking in my face anyway, but I got 44 as a uniform number. So I wore that for 5 or 6 years, and obviously didn't make it well known as he did. So at the Old Timers game just a year ago, the last Old Timers game at the old Yankee Stadium, I was wearing number 44, and so was Reggie, and he was all over me in the dugout. Boy, he wouldn't let me up. So, baseball players' humor and the needling goes on forever. Well, here we were, at least I'm in my 60s. I don't know if he is or not. I guess he is. Still getting on one another about the uniform. So we went over round and round in the dugout about it. But Reggie Jackson stories abound. Of course, I wasn't there when he and Billy Martin had that set two when Billy yanked him out of the outfield in Fenway Park, and Paul Blair went in and replaced him. But we had some good times together, and I still remember going out when he got traded to the Angels. I was a pitching coach, and I went out to Dennis Rasmussen, and the bases were loaded, and I said, make sure you keep the breaking ball away from him. Right now, he really is sitting on everything inside. Sure enough, first pitch, hanging breaking ball, grand slam home run. That's always a fun trip. The pitching coach is just going out, tell him what to do, go back to the dugout before you get in the dugout, a grand slam home run. But that's Reggie. He can rise to the occasion. For the Yankees, the tradition is unique. Probably the most unique of any pro franchise ever, maybe. So that means that the captain of the Yankees, when you have that accolade, that means something special. And of course, when you had Thurman Munson, who died suddenly being the captain of the Yankees, later on Willie Randolph and Ron Guidry shared the captaincy, and well, now the Yankee, of course, and Don Mattingly, who was one of the finest players I've ever seen in my career. Unfortunately, a back injury slowed him down, which probably took him out of the Hall of Fame. But whoa, what a player! Maybe the best defensive first baseman I've seen day in and day out ever in my life. Well, now the Yankees have a captain in Derek Jeter, and I swear I have never seen a player handle the media, handle the limelight of New York, handle the microscope of New York the way Derek Jeter does. He is one of the classiest kids I think I've ever seen, and what a clutch player. Here we are now, and this fall into the postseason, and sure enough, first postseason game against Detroit, he hits a big home run when they need it. And Derek Jeter, if you've ever noticed him, never messing around, always sincere, never loses his cool. He is the epitome of what you would want a professional player to be. And it never ceases to amaze me how, when the going gets tough, he seems to be there. And he's not, and he's not necessarily a rah-rah guy, but he's intense in his own way. And if anybody personifies the Yankee pinstripe tradition, it's Derek Jeter. He's a distinct pleasure for me I'd pay to watch him play day in and day out. He's just special.
Kind of comes full circle, my son, who's named after my dad, he loved baseball as well. And I think too, one story and one memory I always have is we were down at the Jersey Shore visiting my folks, and it was Jeter's last game. And to have the three of us, the two Jeffs and me, the three generations there watching Jeter, in classic Jeter form, have a walk-off hit, really, you wouldn't believe it if somebody scripted it. But that was really neat to have, all three of us together, all three generations together. He showed us every day that, he wanted to be there, and he was there in every way, shape, or form. Well, teaching is about life in addition to baseball, how to be a good man, how to be a good father, how to be a good husband. I mean, he was always there.